Her family sold her for being disabled. But in 3 days, the mountain man discovered the truth. The wind doesn't howl tonight. It listens. In a sagging tool shed behind the Boone house, Clara Boone kneels beside a broken churn, holding her breath, while 2 men trade her name like a coin. Amos Boone wobbles in the yard, whiskey on his tongue, shame in his eyes. Across from him stands Elias Vance, long coat rimmed with frost, a revolver hanging easy at his hip. "Your debt ends when she does as told," Vance murmurs. "Or when you're buried." He drops ash into the snow and crushes the ember under his heel. Through a nail hole, Clara sees more than a face. She sees a scar carved from ear to jaw, a silver locket at his throat, and a fresh brand burned into his glove, a coiled serpent. Her mother once sketched that sigil by candlelight and whispered, "Never show them you stand tall. Crawl until they pass." Clara learned the limp, the soft voice, the lowered gaze. It had always worked until Amos nods toward the shed. "Close," he says, and the word freezes in her mouth. Vance turns and the night tightens. Snow crystals hang as if afraid to fall. He doesn't open the door. He taps the latch with a knuckle and counts the echo. Then he smiles, not at Amos, not at the sky, but at the exact board where Clara hides. 3 days, he says. "I'll give you mercy. I want to see if the girl can stand." His boots crunch away. Clara stares at the locket's faint glimmer through the gap and recognizes the miniature inside. Her mother's likeness, same eyes, same ribbon, the same impossible promise. This man wasn't a stranger on a bad wind. He was a message meant for her. She is not random prey. She is bait. What happened next will shock you. Snow hammered the Montana plains into a hard white plate, shrinking the Boone homestead to a stain beneath a pewter sky. The farmhouse groaned with every gust. Cord pulleys clicked. A loose pane sang in its bed. Cold lived in the parlor. Lamplight shivered. Clara Boone hugged her mother's shawl and tasted iron where worry bit her lip. She had heard Amos Boone sell her with a drunk man's bravery. Now even the clock ticked like a witness. Amos lurched from the kitchen with whiskey clinging to him. He would not meet her eyes. "Keep quiet," he said. 3 days and it's done. Done meant handed over. Clara watched his hands. They were quick when coins appeared and slow when trust was required. Jonah, her cousin, sat near the stove, boots untied, digging clay from the treads with a bent nail. "Pay doesn't mean it," he muttered, not looking up. "He isn't thinking right. He meant to help by hiding." Clara rose and let the weakness she had learned flow into one knee, heel grazing, weight melting, chin lowering. Her mother had taught that posture the winter men bartered safety at gunpoint. Predators pick the limping deer, her mother had said, warming resin between her palms. Let them pass. The lesson had worked until a man like Elias Vance smiled at the exact board that hid her. "You owe me shelter," Clara told Amos. "I owe the roof," he answered, and pretended that was virtue. The latch lifted without a knock, and cold entered first. A man followed and let the wind close behind him. Snow dusted his coat seams. Spruce and smoke followed him in like old companions. Jonah Creed, the trapper from the benches, looked at Amos, then at Jonah, then at Clara without prying. "Storm's building," he said, voice level, as a hand on a skittish horse. "Best finish business before the trail disappears." "Family matter," Amos said, sliding his bulk to block the table as if treasure lay there. Creed laid a parcel on the boards and cut the string. Silver flashed. A stamped paper lay beneath. "Some matters sour a valley," he said. "I'll pay your store and forge debts. You sign a release and keep your mouth shut. I take the girl out of reach." Amos barked a laugh and flinched from it. "You aim to cross Elias Vance. Handing her over keeps him moving. Crossing him brings riders. He hunts what he believes is helpless." Creed said, "He is not weather. Habits can be interrupted." He counted coins. The thin, bright notes sounded like a different kind of air. Greed ran fast across Amos's face. Shame stumbled after and fell. "You'll sign at the store," Creed said. "What do you want?" Amos asked. "Sleep," Creed answered, "and quiet on my mountain. Jonah tugged his laces tight and stared at the floor. Clara wanted him to look at her and choose. He saved himself by staying small. They left at dusk. Creed's mare stood saddled, breath foggy. A second horse waited for Clara, rangy and sharp-eared, its hide the color of wet bark. Creed boosted her with a carpenter's calm and tied her small bundle behind the cantle comb, shawl, salve, and her mother's sketch of a creek bend under fir. Jonah handed up the bundle and whispered, "I won't tell." His words slid away like snow from a low roof. Wind chewed the flats. They rode with chins tucked, eyes narrowed, frost webbing the reins. Hoofbeats hollowed under the crust. The plains stretched to a line of mountains that gathered themselves like ribs against the bruised light. Clara tried to sit small. Habit took hold. Then the horse's steady back pushed against her spine, and something refused the fold. She lifted her head, and the world wide. Creed spoke only when required. Twice he asked if she needed to stop. Once he passed up a hard biscuit and told her to tuck it in her cheek to thaw as they moved. The small practicalities steadied her more than any vow. She chewed smoke and salt and thought of spring water over stone. They angled toward the spruce that darkened the horizon. Air sharpened and turned resin sweet. Every breath cleared one corner of her head. A branch shrugged off its load and thumped the snow beside the trail. Clara jumped. Creed turned a fraction in the saddle. "Could be snow," he said. "Could be a watcher." His tone did not change when he added, "Do not look behind you. Looking freezes people." She wanted to laugh and could not. "How do you know I would?" Everyone looked. They crossed a run sheathed in lace, where water still whispered under the skin, then climbed a longer pitch where trees spaced out and wind moved between them like a low voice. More than once she felt eyes on her back. The pressure grew when the trail opened, and eased when they tucked into thickets. Once a crow flapped from a snag, settled behind them, and did not pass. She told herself that fear wears many coats, and all of them feel convincing. Truth still leaned on her neck. "Why help me?" she asked, when the silence had grown too large. Creed did not turn. "Because men like him treat people as seasons. I trap animals. I do not trap souls." That answer did not ask for gratitude and therefore gave her breath. The climb eased. Dusk pooled in the timber. A small square of light appeared ahead, steady and pale. Creed's cabin sat on a bench above a bend in the creek, logs tight, roof pitched steep, a lean-to tucked under the eaves with tools in a tidy row. Bones cleaned to white waited in a bucket for some practical purpose she could not name. Order lived here, the stern kind that made room for breath without pretending to be mercy. Creed swung down, took her reins, and said, "Inside, I'll see to the horses." His voice held neither invitation nor command, only a place to step. She dismounted slower than needed, the old act trying to reclaim her, then squared her shoulders and crossed the threshold. Heat kissed her face. Log walls were daubed tight. Shelves held tins labeled in tidy script. A broom stood bristles up by the door. A rifle rested on pegs above the hearth. Fire snapped bright and clean. A kettle breathed. On the table sat a folded cloth and a tin cup turned mouth down, as if the room waited for a person rather than a guest. She listened past the crackle and heard the mountain's breath. Beneath it hid another cadence, careful and patient, too light for bear, too sure for wind. Something had come up the trail with them, and kept the trees. She knew it the way a cat knows thunder before the sky speaks. Creed entered, brushed snow onto the mat and slid the bolt without sound. He studied the door as if wood could carry news. Then he looked at her. The look asked nothing, and therefore threatened tears. She swallowed them because tears fed men like Amos. "You did not ask what I owe you," she said. "I want my mountain quiet," Creed answered, "and a hunter of the weak to lose interest." He set a small tin on the table. "Eat." She tasted the biscuit and laughed once, short and astonished. "He will not lose interest." "No," Creed said. "So we give him something else to consider." Wind leaned on the wall. A weight shifted in the trees with deliberation. The cabin felt steady while the world outside tilted, as if the land itself were listening. Fear threaded her bones. Defiance stood beside it and refused to leave. Between the two, a narrow path opened. "Tomorrow we ride to the store," Creed said. Your uncle will sign, and if he refuses, he will sign, Creed said, as though the sentence owed nothing to hope. Clara went to the window and pressed a fingertip into a warm oval bloomed on the glass, proof that she was flesh and not a story. Down in the pines, something moved again, slow and careful. She did not flinch. Let the watcher see a woman who would not pretend to fall. The mountains held their ribs against the sky. The night smelled of smoke, resin, iron, and a coming storm. Somewhere between breath and thought, resolve took root. Whatever had followed them would find a different shape at this door. She breathed, counted 4, and chose to stand taller. Now, morning traced a thin seam of silver along the log walls, and the cabin answered with a soft crackle that stitched warmth through the room. Clara lay still and listened to the fire chew a knot, to the kettle sigh, to snow sliding off the roof in slow sheets. Frost scalloped the window like lace. Order lived here. Broom bristles straight, tin cups nested, a rifle resting on pegs above the hearth. Creed stepped in from the lean-to with a pail and set it by the stove. Storm thickened before dawn, he said. Not enough to bury a horse, enough to hide hooves if a man wants to test a door. He glanced at the latch as if wood could keep secrets. Clara pushed back the quilt and sat. Her body remembered the old lesson. Bend, dim, disappear. She refused it. He had set a plate on the table. Biscuit, cheese, a spoon of jam bright as saved summer. Heat moved through her ribs. You expect riders, she said. I expect men who prefer weak ground. He answered, pouring coffee. Elias Vance walks straight when fear clears his way. When it does not, he circles until a knee drops. She closed both hands around the cup. He will come. Yes, Creed said, naming the weather. He will want to learn whether the girl can stand. The phrase hit like a cold nail tapped flush. She studied him. Stubble shadowed his jaw. A white scar crossed one knuckle. His shirt had been mended cleanly at the cuff. His quiet was a choice, not a plea. Why risk it, she asked. You could leave me with a pastor 2 towns over. That would teach him to shop in churchyards. Creed said. He scraped frost from the inner pane with a thumbnail, peered through the clear smear, then wiped his nail. Better to make the mountain disagree with him. She almost smiled. The fire popped. Both looked at the door. Work steadies a room, he said. Chickens need feed. Walk where I walked. Clara pulled on boots and a coat that carried wood smoke in its seams. Outside, the world showed only 3 colors: white snow, black trunks, slate sky pressing low. Drifts leaned against the north wall. Cold bit her teeth. Her breath rose in little ghosts. She stepped into the narrow prints Creed had made and felt the crust hold. The coop crouched under a shed roof weighted with stones. Warmth met her face. Sour straw and feather rustle. A barred hen pecked her boot as if to judge her balance. Peace, she said, hands open. Her voice did not shake. She reached beneath a brooding hen and found an egg warm as a pocketed stone. Another, then another. Shells clicked softly in the basket. Creed widened the path with a shovel, breath steady, eyes moving. He worked without hurry or waste. She felt watched by the trees, not by him. That difference made space in her chest. She gathered faster. When the basket was filled, she straightened and did not let the old sag take her shoulders. The sky held. No rider split the timber. Inside, the cabin glowed. Snow slid off the roof and landed with a sodden thump. She wiped eggs with a cloth, set them in a rack, and swept the floor, each stroke a measured whisper. Along the grain, Creed hung the shovel, shook snow from his hat, and gave a small nod. Approval that did not make noise. Men who hunt fear arrive with cover, he said, unlacing a boot to chip ice from the cleats. Wind, night, a drunk crowd. They liked to rhyme their steps with louder ones. A thin sound threaded the winter then, so faint she almost mistook it for her pulse. The horses in the lean-to tossed and blew. Creed lifted his head. Clara held her breath. The thread thickened into something like hooves, then unraveled into silence. The mountain took it back. Could be roots in wind, he said. Could be iron on powder. We plan as if who, we rest as if wind. How does one rest like that, she asked. By working, he said. Hands lead thoughts into daylight. She cleaned the table until it shone, then stacked kindling the way he stacked it. Edges even, end grain turned one way. She watched her hands learn the room's language. Each finished task weighed less than fear, yet anchored more. Eat again, he said at noon, sliding half his portion across. The kettle hummed. The fire fell to a bed of glow and lifted when he fed it. She studied the rifle. You keep that close because of me. I keep it close because men like him exist, he said. You gave the mountain a reason. The plain truth steadied more than vows. Snow returned, fine as sifted flour, relentless, almost soundless. It whispered on the roof and erased the yard. If riders were out there, they wore that whisper now. Clara mixed the dough, flour, salt, fat cut with a knife, and a slow pour of water. She turned the mass until it smoothed, patted it flat and laid it on the griddle. The smell rose, simple and strong. We ride to town tomorrow, Creed said, watching the door. Your uncle will sign in daylight, and if he does not, he will, he said, as if reporting a sunrise already finished. She carried plates to the table. When she reached for her cup, her hand did not tremble. The old shape inside her shifted, like a trapped thing noticing the cage door standing open, and not trusting freedom to be real. She set the cup down and watched flame comb the wood. There are moments when a person learns the trap was never iron, she said, partly to the heat, partly to anyone who had felt such walls. If you have known a box built from fear, and the hand that eased the lid, remember that sometimes an ally arrives quietly, steadies the room, and shows you how to stand. Creed did not answer. He added a log and sat. Night will measure what we kept busy, he said. The window turned to a pale mirror that showed two shapes and a door between them. A hen clucked once, then tucked her head. The horses stamped, then settled. Clara found a shawl she had not used and draped it over her shoulders without hunching. She moved with a wider step, weight centered, arms loose, careful and sure. A new rhythm reached them, heavier, cleaner, the kind of sound leather makes when it remembers a rider. Creed stood, took the rifle down and checked the chamber. Horses, he said. Clara lifted a second gun, because her hands no longer asked permission. The stock felt honest, the weight steady. She looked at the door and saw not just wood and iron, but a line in the earth. Outside, the storm listened. The mountain held its breath like a hunter holding the last inch of draw. The sound grew, then softened, then slid sideways, as if whoever made it had learned the yard's blind spots. Creed moved to the window's edge. He did not peer out. He watched light along the sill, the shift of reflection, the way shadows thickened and thinned. Testing, he said. Counting windows, mapping squeaks, he finished. Stand by the corner, he added. She moved, breath firm. The rhythm faded. Then the mountain went quiet. Creed lowered the rifle. He studied her stance and nodded once. Courage held. Outside, snow learned her name. Inside, the fire kept its steady heart. Dawn lines the cabin floor with pale gold, while snow leans against the window and turns the world to hush. Clara lifts the kettle, steam kissing her lashes, and pours it into the basin. Pine smoke, iron, and simmering broth braid the air. She reaches for the broom, and forgetting the practiced sag, plants her feet and sweeps in long, certain strokes that gather crumbs in a neat ridge. No wobble, no tilt. Creed stands in the doorway with a coil of rawhide, hat in his other hand. He doesn't grin, he eases his voice. You're no weakling. The words arrive without accusation, only recognition. Clara stops, cheeks warming. The old habit tries to pull her knee inward, bend her neck, and diminish her height. Her spine stays true. I never claimed to be lame, she says. Steady. I let people think it. You were taught to waste strength to survive, he replies. A ritual like that can turn bones hollow. She leans the broom aside. Wind presses the logs and slides off. My mother said smallness can pass under a hunter's gaze. We moved from church to shack to wagon. Men stare at bright things. They miss what crouches. She swallows. I learned to be shade. Shade keeps breath in the chest until weather shifts, he says, setting his hat on a peg. Then shade becomes a snare. It did, she answers. The admission raw. Vance heard me breathe in the shed. Amos pointed with a shrug. The trick made me prize instead of ghost. Outside, the slope wears a glassy crust. Drifts curled like ribs. She touches the pain. Cold bites the bone. Mountains stand blue and severe, stripped by wind. She sees herself in that glare, strength hidden under a brittle film, pretending to be softness. Creed pours coffee, slides a tin cup over. Drink, then tell the rest. She drinks, and finds heat for truth. She taught the limp, loose shawl, plain hair, soft replies, counting doors, never standing framed. Once it saved us. A rider glanced, looked past, and chose another trail. I wore that as armor. Later men learned the costume. A costume fools eyes until eyes learn pattern, he said. Predators listen for rehearsed fear. It sings one note they can follow. He turns the coil. Your mother kept you alive. That fact stands beside this one. The same method nearly sold you. Guilt and gratitude argue inside her. She opens her hands. I feel both. Let both sit, he says. Now we practice something new. He will return. We meet him as people who know their own weight. Teach me. Creed lifts the rifle from its pegs, checks the action, and lays it on the table. First, weight. Feet set so the floor cannot move you. Second, sight. Calm lives between heartbeat and breath. He opens a palm. Hands. Clara places her fingers where he shows. The wood feels warm and oiled. He rotates her elbow a fraction. Put bone under the work. Muscle tires. Bone carry. They step into air that flashes white and cuts clean. Tin lids swing from a post by the creek. Black trunks etch the field. He hands ear caps and a scarf to blunt the glare. We start close, he says. Close matters when fear gets loud. He stands behind, and to the left, voice low enough to slip under the wind. Front foot forward, heel dug. Lean like you mean to argue with a shove. Let lungs settle. Breathe once. On the pause, press. No jerk, no begging the tool. She tastes iron and resin. The first shot bucks, smacking her shoulder, sends snow puffing from the post. The lid rings and spins. Laughter breaks loose, bright and shocked. Again, he says. They work until her arms tremble. He shortens sessions, stretches fingers, and shifts the stock along the collarbone. Pain teaches wrong lessons, he says. Right ones keep you useful tomorrow. A hawk wheels above the ridge. Crows scold from a snag. Somewhere a limb breaks with a sound like distant fire. She learns to wait for quiet and to take it. Each hit sinks a post inside her that will not tip. Back at the table, they reload. Creed wipes metal and squares oiled cloths. If he rides with company, they will move faster than you're thinking, he says. Drill makes the thought small enough to fit inside a breath. Why this much help? She asks. Her stance already wider. A trader would have ridden on. You call it help, he says. I call it choosing which animals a valley keeps. Fearful men breed certain animals. Then let this valley starve that breed, she says. That's the work. Afternoon slides to a blue that looks like steel. Clouds stack in the west. Clara brings wood. Line splits. Stacks kindling tight. She moves from task to task with a gait that no longer lies. Once the broom tempts the old slump, she feels it and does not surrender. The choice stings and heals at once. Stew simmers. She speaks to the heart for anyone who needs the words. Some of us wear masks the world taught us. Costumes that dim us so we live through rough seasons. She murmurs, if you know that mask, ask whether it still guards you or hands you over. If it hands you over, set it down before night decides for you. The thought settles without pleading. An ember offered to unknown hands. Creed hears and keeps his eyes on the spoon. He passes a bowl. Eat. Dusk arrives fast, dragging long bars of shadow. The view flattens to white banks. Black trees. A strip of creek like hammered pewter. Wind sharpens. They bar the door and bank the fire. Horses shift in the lean-to. Hens thump once and go quiet. Clara checks the rifle and sits where Creed can watch her, and the door at once. Breath lengthens. Calm finds a notch behind her ribs. At first the sound is nothing more than the mind rehearsing, a memory wearing iron shoes. Then it gathers into cadence. Metal on hardened snow. A pause. Metal again. More than one set, moving slow to keep leather quiet. Creed rises and does nothing showy. He snuffs the lamp, slides the bolt once more for feel, and braces the jam. Clara stands with the rifle proper in her hands. The cabin breathes warm wall, cold seam, ember eye. Outside, riders try to teach the mountain to forget their weight. The mountain listens and refuses. She plants her feet, counts a breath, and in the still part between numbers, feels the old mask loosen and fall, soft as ash. Night leans close, measuring the shape she keeps now. The cadence drifts left, then right, mapping squeaks and testing. Snow hisses from a shaken branch. A horse stamps. Another answers. No voices, no laughter. Patience squats in the yard like a man. Creed touches her sleeve once, grounding her, and points toward the corner covering the hinge. She moves and holds. Beyond the coop, a bit snaps against a bridle with a ping. Hooves fall back a few paces, then wait as if the night considers whether to come through the door or the dark. Night fell like a dropped curtain, and the cabin shrank to a tight box of heat and shadow stitched by ember glow. Snow drove in ribbons across the bench, packed against the lower plank, and erased every print. Clara took the corner. Creed taught her, cheek on oiled stock, stance wide, breath steady on the pause. Creed pinched the lamp dark and checked the gun slit he had cut years ago for nights like this. Wind pressed the logs and slid away as if the mountain were listening with its whole body. A hoof cracked the crust once, paused, then cracked again. A second answered from the creek line, softer, then two more, spaced with care. Leather rubbed. Iron kissed stone and swallowed the clink. Creed rested a palm on the bolt, tapped the sill twice, and stilled. Clara closed her eyes and counted by sound. 1 behind the sled, 2 near the coop, 1 at the rain barrel, 3 along the creek bank. A watcher held back in the trees, weight off the saddle, measuring 8 in all. Cabin snug, a low voice said from the dark. Old trapper made it neat. Neat burns nice. Another murmured. Vance says light the overhang. Smoke drags men out. Creed made a cutting motion with 2 fingers. Wait. A shadow peeled from the porch post and inched toward the window with a pistol angled flat. He grazed a tripline strung low along the drift, frowned, and nudged it with his boot. The peg popped. A slab slid on a guide and hammered his shoulder to the snow. He swore. Creed fired once through the slit. The man sagged and lay still. Muzzle flashes winked under the furs. Bullets thudded into the door, and 8 splinters from the frame inches above Clara's hair. She did not duck. She breathed and let fear run the length of her spine, then caged it behind the front sight. Count, Creed said. Hold for the wind. A gust rattled the lean-to and died. A runner rose from a trough and sprinted for the woodpile, bent low. Clara pressed on the quiet beat between breaths. The shot slapped the night. The figure folded into the drift and vanished. Her hands shook after, not before. Creed touched her sleeve once. Good. Outside, a man dragged a plank as a shield, while another crawled toward the coop. The plank bumped a hidden snare, jawed around a buried hook. Teeth snapped, caught his heel, and twisted him down. He screamed high. Horses reared in the lean-to. Ropes creaked. Boards thudded. Creed shot into the plank. The scream broke into the wind. Smoke thickened, blue and bitter, crawling along the rafters. Lanterns bobbed beyond the yard like cold moons. 2 shapes slipped toward the creek, where the snow lay smooth and the moon drew a hard ribbon. Left bank, Clara whispered. Long, Creed said. Let them think we cannot reach. He fed cartridges with neat economy, never wasting a finger's motion, his eyes living at the edges of dark. Fire the eaves, someone hissed. A bottle arced, throat aflame. Creed cracked the back door and flung a soaked blanket across the lean-to wall. Steam roared. Another bottle swept low and right. Clara led it a hair and shot. Glass burst mid-flight. Flame hissed into the snow and died. They surged again. A runner charged the door, leapt over the first wire, cleared the second, and slammed his shoulder into the planks. Creed fired through the hinge gap and took meat. The runner tumbled into a snare that sprang and bit high on his thigh. He howled. His partner grabbed the chain to yank him free. The chain ran to a bent sapling, held by a loop. The loop slipped. The sapling released and slung the partner backward into a drift, so hard the sound left him in a single broken grunt. Gunfire stuttered, then steadied. Snow smoked under the flashes. Wind veered and drew powder across the yard in silver sheets that stripped men of shape and gave them back again. Clara kept her feet, shifted left, breathed, and pressed on the pause. Another muzzle winked behind a stump. She moved a fraction, made the picture go empty, then offered a new one. When the hat lifted to reacquire, she took the sliver between brim and cheek. He fell without flourish, like a sack losing its string. A voice came from the timber without strain. "Step out, Creed, and we call it square. Send the girl, and the debt end. Refuse and your neat house gets brighter than any star." It was boring and sure. Vance, not close, yet near enough that tone carried like frost across glass. He had memorized the wires, the pegs, the angles. He expected the cabin to fly. Creed set more traps with memory. A fresh trip along the churn path. A bell hidden under a pan by the rain barrel. A snare mouth reset and widened. He will probe, withdraw, and return from a new quarter, he said. We make each probe cost. He kicked the embers wide, so no single blaze sketched their bodies. Drink. He pushed a tin toward Clara. Iron under the coffee steadied her. Moon broke the cloud deck and turned the yard to bone and ink. Blood went black on that canvas. Breath climbed from horses in torn pieces. A splinter had cut Clara's cheek. Warm wet traced her jaw into her collar. She did not wipe it. She kept sight of the space between two furs, where the dark held too still. Think of a time you stood at a small door, and fear tried to set your feet. She breathed. A thread for anyone who might need it. Think of a hand that steadied you or a word that gave you spine. Hold that now. The sentence rode the fire's soft song, and settled in the room like a promise. Hooves surged. 3 men came at once. One low, one wide right, one using a sled runner as a moving shield. The low man hit the hidden bell. It rang once, clean as iron on iron, and Creed's shot answered that syllable. The runner blundered into a buried picket and flipped face first into powder. The shield man braced to fire under his plank. Clara took the black triangle between the edge and the snow. His aim died with a sigh. A pause stretched, then Vance again closer to the cottonwood. Enough, pull out. No anger. A marker moved. Patience banked for later. Shapes gathered the fallen. A wounded voice begged and shrank to a hiss, as snow packed into torn cloth. Men backed their horses carefully, trying not to jangle, trying to become mist. The mountain heard iron anyway. Silence returned by inches. The wind talked to itself. The lean-to dripped. Creed kept the rifle high, until even the creak grew loud again. He lowered it last and turned. He studied Clara the way a carpenter studies a beam he has found under a wall, testing for soundness with the flat of his palm. Her arms shook, then quieted. She breathed once, long, and the tremor drained into the floor through her boots. He will return, she said, not ask. He never loses a piece without learning the board, Creed said. Next time he will change the weather or the hour. He will borrow a townsman, a lantern or a preacher's step. He will bring a different game. Then we make the mountains speak with one voice, she said. We will, he answered. They smothered the last glow under the eaves. Steam hung and twisted. The room smelled of char, powder, wet wool, horse and pine torn by wire. Moonlight lay across the table like a blade left to cool. Clara cleaned the stock with a square of oiled cloth, and set the rifle on its pegs, with deliberate care, as if restoring a word she intended to use again. Quiet returned in layers. The easy hush of flame, the slide of drift off the roof, the far creek sowing its patient metal song. She washed the blood from her cheek with water so cold it almost took her breath, pressed the cloth until the sting went numb, and studied the faint ghost in the window with steady eyes. Snow brightened as clouds thinned, then dimmed as a fresh band closed. Somewhere an owl called once and waited for a reply that did not come. Clara sat and felt the room settle after the violence. She looked at the door that held, the hinges that groaned, the board that took splinters, and knew as clearly as she knew the sight picture that Vance admired patience more than fury. She blew out the lamp, bolted the door, and waited for the second night coming. Dawn crept over the bench like a thin blade, and the cabin breathed smoke and quiet. Creed sat near the hearth, while Clara cleaned the graze along his side, pressing hot linen until blood slowed. He did not flinch. Outside, wind-coned pines shook snow from boughs and drove powder against chinked logs. "Keep breathing," she said. "Almost finished." "I am," he answered. Bullet skipped off rib. "Luck favors people who prepare." She smiled without showing teeth. "Or people who refuse to fall." She tied a neat binding and checked for seep. The fire hummed. Steam braided with pine pitch and singed wool. His hat hung on its peg, brim damp with thaw. Boots rested square, soles angled toward the blaze. Calm gathered on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Clara fed him broth from a tin cup. He sipped, set it down and studied the door. "We cannot trap the same ground twice and expect the same result," he said. "He will try daylight or borrow Gawkers to shield his men. Town offers both." Her stomach tightened. Town meant faces, gossip, the counter with its peppermint jar, the clerk who watched women like merchandise, the marshal who laughed when freight hands tipped crates. Town meant Amos reaching for a coin while pretending Providence delivered it. "If we ride there," she said, "we cut through eyes that never saw me except when it suited them." "We need those eyes now," Creed said. "They must see him, hear him, measure what he buys. Hiding helps him. Sun and witnesses help you." "Witnesses sold me," she said. She remembered shaping herself to pass invisibly, and how invisibility became a route into a cage. "Amos will call it debt, duty, family. He will claim regret, never responsibility." "Stand anyway," he said. "Call his words by their right names. He is a seller. You are not sold." Wind leaned on the east wall and sighed along the rafters. Light brightened the frosted pane, then dimmed as the cloud returned. Down the slope, the creek moved under ice, a steady iron note. The world beyond the door looked pure, yet tracks lay under the crust, theirs and others, running from last night into whatever came next. Clara hauled in wood and stacked it tight under the bench. Each split thumped like a heartbeat. Creed watched, letting her occupy the room with steps that no longer lied. When she finished, he slid the rifle onto the table, sighted along the barrel, checked for dings, and oiled the moving parts with patient hands. "You should rest," she said. "I rest when work sits where it belongs," he replied. "Pain is a poor captain. Purpose makes better weather." She laughed once. "Then steer us." "We ride at dusk," he said. "Snow will soften the path and muffle sound. We stop by the Miller place, borrow a sled, take the lower road through Willow and Alder, and reach town when lanterns lift. And when we arrive, we go to the clerk, have Amos sign with proper witnesses. Then we speak plain words in a crowded room until the lie cannot stand." She touched the bandage. "Can you ride that long?" "I can ride longer," he said. "Then softer, if you keep the pace sane." Silence settled, full with shared weight. She brewed coffee, poured 2 cups, and watched him cradle heat. Flames turned orange to blue and collapsed into coal. The quiet between them held no awkwardness. His steadiness steadied her. A new part of herself assembled around that anchor, a frame built from honest motion, clean aims and refusal to shrink. Snow began again, tight grains sifting from the ceiling of cloud. Wind rose, carried a long howl along the ridge, and dropped it into the yard like a warning. The distance felt larger than miles. The mountain held them like a hand closing around 2 small sparks, not to smother, but to shelter until they could move. She wrapped food in cloth, laid out cartridges, hot stones and canvas for the sled. Creed stitched a torn glove, kept his stitches even, and bit the thread. She cleaned lantern chimneys until the glass shone. He tested wicks and trimmed them. Together they set tack, checked buckles, and rubbed ice from leather with tallow. Between tasks, they listened for hooves and heard only wind-changing keys. "When we stand in that store," she said, "people will pretend surprise. They will ask why I never came forward." "Answer the way you fired last night," he said, on the quiet part of the breath. "Steady. Say you were trained to appear small because smallness kept you alive." Some men read that as permission, and one man tried to buy it. "Then say you are done with performances and will not be purchased. And if they laugh, let them reveal themselves," he said. "Truth does not beg laughter to be kind." She nodded. Fear remained, yet it seemed narrower, contained by decision. She lifted the rifle, checked the sights, then shouldered it until it felt like an extension rather than an object. He watched, eyes warm, mouth still. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not making speeches." He snorted. "Words eat meat if cooks let them." She smiled. The kettle sang. She dried the cup and set it upside down. Ritual returned order to breath. Outside, daylight dimmed, and the sky hardened to pewter. Creed rose carefully, tested the bandage, buttoned his coat, and settled the hat low. She wrapped a scarf around his throat and tucked it under the collar. Fingers gentle, mind clear. He accepted the care without pride or apology. They stepped into snow that squeaked under their weight, then hushed as flakes deepened. The yard had lost last night's violence under a clean layer, though here and there a dark fleck marked where blood had steamed and frozen. The coop sat quietly. Horses blew patient clouds. The mountains faded to shadows. Clara closed the door and pulled the latch. For a breath she stood with palm against wood, feeling warmth on one side, cold on the other, and knew both belonged to the same day. She bowed her head, not as a surrender, but an acknowledgement. Then she lifted it and met Creed's eyes. "Ready," she said. "Ready," he echoed. They walked to the lean-to, moving in step. Wind wrapped around them and sang low, grief and promise braided together. The glow behind the window burned steadily, a small sun in a hard world. Ahead lay town, a room full of faces, a counter, a pen and paper waiting for names that meant something new. Snow whispered around the eaves. All night. Dusk lowered as Clara and Creed guided the sled off the mountain bench toward town. Snow falling in tight veils that caught the last copper light. The runners whispered over crust. The horses blew pale clouds that rose, broke, and slid away along the wind like shed breaths. Willows bent. Alders ticked against sleeves. The lower road tunneled between white banks that looked like sleeping cattle. Creed sat square, the bandage hidden beneath his coat, hands loose on the lines, jaw set, eyes reading ruts and drift lips. Clara counted posts and fence seams, mapping exits the way he had taught her, listening for iron where air wore a different mask. By the time the first sheds appeared, mill bells tolled the change of shift and coal smoke sagged over the flats, staining snow the color of ash and leaving a taste like old nails. Torches burned at porch posts, flaring whenever a gust slid around a corner. A teamster clucked at mules and looked away fast, as though eye contact might draft him into an oath he could not keep. Children ran, saw rifles, and stopped as if ice had grown around their boots. Faces gathered behind frosted panes. At the livery, a boy reached for a bridle and froze, eyes round as coins. Someone whispered that the trapper had dragged Trouble down from the benches. Someone else said Trouble had already slept over the tavern and sold fear by the glass. They slid into the main street. Lanterns rattled. The forge hissed. The clerk stood inside his door with a ledger open and a pen lifted like a stalled thought. The marshal leaned under the eave with a hat pulled low, pretending boredom so hard it looked like a strain. Pastor Wren stepped onto the church stoop and forgot to breathe. Amos Boone shouldered forward from the crowd as if thirst alone pulled him, eyes shiny, cheeks chafed by wind and the lie he had feeding himself. Vance waited by the pump as if he owned the square. His coat was brushed, his hat square, a neat strip of linen tied around one hand where a snare had bitten. A locket hung at his throat and caught torchlight like a wink from a coin. 6 riders eased near him, spaced with care, hands hanging close to belts. Boots already turned for the cleanest lane. Creed set the sled crosswise to block part of the street and reined the team until their haunches sank into the snow. He looked at Vance the way a carpenter measures a beam, testing, not impressed. "Evening," Creed said, voice level enough to roll under porches. "You left your hill early," Vance answered, his smile cool. "Business," Creed said. "So have I," Vance replied. Clara swung down, boots sinking to the ankle, shawl tight, rifle slung. She did not look at guns first. She looked at people, at the seam of shame around eyes that had known the price of a thing before they knew its name. When she spoke, her voice threaded the space without strain. "Listen," she said. "A drunk uncle weighed me on a counter." A buyer nodded. "They named a price before they asked who I was. My mother taught me to live through hard seasons. Men like this one learned the costume and called it permission. He kidnaps. He sells women. He thrives when folks look away." A ripple ran through the knot of bodies. Some faces flinched. Some hardened like clay burnt too long. Amos lifted both hands and tried for sorrow. "I was ruined," he said. "I meant to send for her later. I only meant to settle account." "You kept your cup full," Clara answered. "You kept your wages. You did not keep me." She turned toward Pastor Wren. "When coin changes hands for a woman, what does the book call that?" The pastor shut his eyes. "Slavery," he said softly, "and theft." Coal smoke folded and refolded over the square like heavy cloth. Torches guttered, recovered, spat sparks that died when they kissed the hard snow. Vance touched the locket and let it fall. "Crowds like theater," he said mildly. "Crowds are customers whose pockets fear will always open." "Put the rifle down, girl. Tell them you lied, got scared and need a gentleman to guide you home." His riders shifted their weight, measuring angles, ready to turn a word into a shot. Creed did not look away from Vance when he spoke to the clerk and the marshal. "Bring the ledger. Amos Boone will sign a release with witnesses. Then we walk into the church and hear what neighbors call the price he named." The clerk looked to the marshal. The marshal watched Vance. Vance watched Amos with lazy interest. A cat studying a mouse. Amos stepped toward the doorway, halted, looked back and froze between debts. "Time ends," Vance said, and drew. The motion was clean, wrist sure, barrel rising toward Clara's chest. Creed shot first. His revolver cracked like split eye. Vance buckled and went to one knee, catching himself on the pump handle with his bandaged hand, while his coat bloomed dark at the ribs. He grinned, not from humor but from habit, and tried to raise the pistol again. Two riders yanked iron. Another grabbed a panicked horse by the cheek strap. Clara unslung and planted as she had trained, feet rooted, bone under muscle, breath finding the still part between beats. "Put them away," Pastor Wren called, voice suddenly iron. Miners stepped forward with shovels across their shoulders. Women lined the storefronts and blocked doors with unflinching bodies. Townsmen lifted torches high enough to throw a red wall between pump and sled. The marshal finally moved his hand from his coat and settled it on his holster, not as a threat, but as a decision. Amos shook, reached the counter, seized the pen, and scratched his name with a trembling flourish. The clerk sanded the wet ink and lifted the page with fingers that shook anyway. Vance's eyes glittered above a mouth caught between charm and snarl. "You will not hold," he said softly. "Night remembers me." He pushed upright, blood wetting his glove, and snapped an order. Two riders spurred into the alley that fed the freight yard, hunting a flank. Creed pivoted, winced and recovered. Clara slid to cover and tracked the nearer rider's elbow, stealing his nerve without firing by placing the bead where his mind had expected a miss. He wavered, cursed and pulled back. "Listen," she told the street, loud enough to slice through curses and prayer. "This ends when you say it does. If you stand quietly." He carts daughters, cousins, widows, anyone who looks alone. "If you speak, he runs out of names." Torches hissed, sparks climbed, glass shattered under stray shots aimed at signs rather than hearts. A petty tantrum dressed as retreat. Horses plunged, were checked, then backed. Coal smoke deepened until it felt like a second night pressing into ribs. The clock above the counter ticked in heavy strokes that sounded like a hammer in a quiet shop. The marshal lifted the paper and tapped the signature for every watcher to see. Pastor Wren set a hand on the church copy, and squared his shoulders. The shame that had hovered like low weather crossed several faces, and kept going. Resolve lit others from within, cold and clean. Vance laughed, brittle and thin. "Curtains down," he said. He whistled one. His men fired into the air, smashed lamps, cut signboards, and wheeled away through flying splinters. The square dissolved into churned slush, sharp shouts, running feet, and the hot iron smell of blood warming cold air. Then the smoke thinned enough to show what remained. Vance vanished toward the yard with 2 riders tight behind him. 3 others trailed at a distance, throwing looks over their shoulders as though expecting the town to grow teeth. Creed holstered and let out a breath that turned white and broke apart in torchlight. He looked at Clara. She met his gaze and nodded. "He is wounded," she said. "He will not sleep. He will return." Her voice carried like a bell struck inside bone. The crowd eased apart, leaving a clear path from pump to sled. Hands reached and squeezed her sleeve. Words rose, brief thanks, awkward promises, hard truths, said softly. Others had none. The marshal set the release on the counter where anyone could touch it, and not call it a rumor. Pastor Wren lifted his copy high. "Tomorrow we gather, record and bar our gates," he said for all. Eyes wet, chin steady. Clara turned toward the alley where coal smoke folded like a dark river, over rails and stacked cordwood. Snow fell harder, torches guttered, caught again and trembled. Somewhere in the yard, a whistle sounded short and low, then died. She settled the rifle across the sled and faced the town one last time. "Do not look away when doors close," she said. "Hold the light." Creed clicked to the T. Runners bit, slid, found purchase, and carried them forward while the street behind stood very still, listening to its own heartbeat, ash on its tongue, fire in its eye. The jail should have held like winter, iron sunk to stone, bolts clean, keys asleep in the marshal's pocket. By midnight it was an empty mouth breathing coal smoke. Someone cut hinge pins and swept the prints with spruce, dragging snow through the gap as if erasing a name. Word moved faster than the wind. Vance slipped the cell, took 2 horses, and left a dark smear on the pump handle, a curved witness shining dull under lantern soot. Creed read the note. The marshal tacked by the door at dawn, bandaged tight, eyes colder than the creek under ice. Clara felt the town draw inward, doors closing, shutters clapping like hands. Miners piled timbers across alleys. A woman carrying coal met Clara's gaze and nodded once. "Small and honest as a coin. Trail," Creed said. "No sermon, only direction." They took the lower road where willows bowed, glassed with rime, and alders ticked against sleeves. Snow feathered harder, filling ruts, softening rocks, making the sled hiss instead of sing. Clara's breath rose and broke, swallowed by the ridge's larger breath. They climbed into a corridor of white and echo. The bench where Creed had set snares lay blank as scraped parchment. The creek went under a shelf of ice and returned dull as hammered tin. Creed scanned the slope and kept the team at a walk. "He will try the choke above the switch," he said. "Wind funnels there, sound folds." The first shot struck a sapling and chewed frost into glitter. Creed barked to the team, cut left, and the sled bit, skidded and corrected. Snow lifted in torn sheets. The second shot gouged the runner. Clara slid off, landed knee-deep and shouldered the rifle, sight clearing with a long blink. Muzzle smoke gulped, flattened, vanished. She fired at the gap between trunk and drift. A hat flipped backward. A horse screamed and thrashed, reins slapping like snakes. "Higher," Creed called. They moved along the bench, taking a fallen log for cover. Clara counted, lay in another round. Creed's face had gone gray where pain salted him, yet his hands were absolute. He planted the team, looped lines, drew his revolver, and pointed at a notch shaped like a wolf's ear. There, hooves hammered that notch and stopped. Silence cracked. Vance spoke, voice even and almost kind. "You cost me men and spoiled a market that pays regularly. You could have stayed on your hill and let winter finish the week." "Some weak learn to stand," Creed said. "Send her out," Vance answered. "Keep your breath. I want a neat story." Fear rose in Clara like a cold tide. She let it touch bone and pass. She eased right, boots whispering, skirt wet to the thigh, gloves iced where breath touched hide. Pine pitch pricked the air. Wind shifted. Hoof smells slid into the hollow. A gloved hand lifted a branch, then settled. Snow thickened until the world narrowed to white static and black lines. Creed fired twice to make the shooters lean. Clara ran low to a wind-thrown trunk. A bullet struck bark and burrow. Chips snapped her cheek. Warm, wet traced her jaw into the scarf. She did not stop. The ridge shoved a gust down the crease like a river of knives. Shots cracked. A man slid from behind a sled frame and lunged. Clara aimed center and pressed on the breath's flat stern. He folded and painted a starburst across the snow. Another shape fired blindly. Creed answered with a single shot that made the stillness. The team tossed, harness ringing like bells in a hard church. "Girl," Vance called. "You want a clean ledger or a dirty hill? I can write either." He stepped above a split stump, coat flared, bandage darker, locket bright as a trapped moon, clever and doomed by pride. Creed's rifle clicked dry. He hissed when the wound tugged. "Take my sidearm," he said. He passed the revolver, eyes steady, bone under muscle. She nodded and moved, flanking, counting steps as if each were a prayer with teeth. The revolver's weight felt honest and inevitable. The storm stalled. The world became a still room with white walls and a black door. Vance stepped through to find her. They saw each other at the same instant. No time for cleverness, only decision. He lifted his gun. She was already on a pause. The revolver bucked, voice low and final. His shot went wide. Hers struck the rib he had wrapped. He staggered and bared teeth. She pressed again and took the shoulder. He snarled and came forward. Not a buyer now, only a man breaking toward whatever remained his. She pressed a third time. The round caught the heart's hard door. He spun, fell across the stump, slid into drift, and lay against pine roots with eyes open to a sky that would not change for him. Blood worked into snow and made a bright fan that dulled as frost took it. The locket lay 6 inches from his fingers. Lid sprung, miniature turned up, a woman's face, delicate and worn, ribbon faded to a ghost. Clara looked once, then away. A riderless horse broke crust, struggled and settled. Creed came slowly, one hand on his side. He studied Vance, then Clara. "You stood where there was no shelter and made one," he said. She wiped the revolver on her skirt seam and handed it back. "I stood," she answered. No triumph, only truth. She turned her head slightly, as if someone beyond the trees might need the words. "If you have known sky leaning until breath narrowed, remember this. Strength often waits under panic like a hidden ember. When the wind finds you, cup that ember and breathe until it becomes flame. You do not need to look like a hero to choose a direction." They gathered, dropped guns, eased the sled around the drift, and led the riderless horse by the bit. Snow that had blinded them softened, falling straight, large and forgiving. Creed's color went sallow. Clara packed snow in a cloth and pressed it to the bandage. He grunted and shook his head. "I have had worse," he lied, which meant he could ride. By the lower trail, the light tilted toward blue. Smoke from town pooled beyond the flats like a low lake. The team leaned into traces with the trust that makes hard work sing. Clara kept walking until the sled steadied, then climbed in and sat beside Creed. He held the lines, passed one to her, and let himself breathe deeper than he had since dawn. "We will tell it plain," he said. "We will," she answered. The ridge released them. Wind eased. The creek spoke more boldly where ice. They topped the last rise and saw lanterns gather at the road, moving toward them through half-light like a chain of careful stars, and felt for the first time in days that the hill would not always be a battlefield. The slope unrolled beneath the runners in silver bands, while dusk gathered like wool. Creed's breath soared, but he kept the lines gentle, one gloved hand resting light against Clara's wrist in a wordless thanks. "You did what had to be done," he said, voice roughened by cold and relief. She answered with a small nod that felt larger than any oath, and faced the road ahead. They rode on, exhausted and alive, snow sighing under runners. Snow softened the square by morning, and the town held its breath like a chest after a hard run. Deputies drove the last of Vance's riders towards scrub south of the tracks and collected dropped pistols like dead wasps. Lanterns still burned in daylight as if the clouds could not be trusted. Coal smoke curled from chimneys and smudged painted letters above the store and livery. Children stood on thresholds counting bullet scars with solemn fingers. Women tacked blankets over cracked windows. Men lifted charred boards and spoke in short sentences that wasted nothing but ash. Clara and Creed slid from the sled at the clinic. The door stood open, white curtains lifting like calm lungs. Dr. Harris met them at the sill, sleeves rolled, jaw set, spectacles fogged. Inside, he said. Creed tried to wave him off, made one stubborn step, and let pride go when pain struck like a hammer. Clara shouldered the rest without ceremony. The cot creaked. The room smelled of carbolic wool and coffee reheated twice. "You'll live," the doctor said after washing powder burns and knotting a clean bandage. "Ribs want quiet. Learn that skill," Creed grimaced. "I prefer motion." "So do injuries," the doctor replied, dropping a small bottle into Clara's palm. 2 drops at a time. Warm cloth each hour. Make him count breaths instead of plans. Creed tried to sit. Clara set 2 fingers to his shoulder, and he stayed. Outside, townsfolk formed a slow line at the church while Pastor Wren copied statements in tidy script. The marshal pinned the signed release on the notice board so it would stop being a rumor. A miner hammered a plank over a star-shaped hole in the tavern door. The square settled into a quiet that felt like water finding its level. Then Amos Boone appeared under the lintel, hat crushed in both hands, cheeks gray with a man who learned shame late and badly. He looked at Creed, then at Clara, who now stood straight without performing smallness. He almost turned away. "Girl," he said, voice raw, "I have no right to ask anything. Bottle took judgment. Debt took the rest. Mercy could return something I lost." "No," Clara said. "Not cruel, not loud. Only true. You traded me. You used a trick my mother taught to survive and sold it as proof I could be carried like freight. I cannot hold your comfort. Walk home sober or do not walk at all." Amos swallowed, moved the hat as if that could change the air, nodded once, and stepped back into daylight that judged without speaking. News from the ridge traveled faster than any sworn page. A rider brought the broken locket wrapped in cloth. Pastor Wren set it in a plain box beside the release and said nothing. People filed past quietly, touching the table with fingertips, as if some vow might soak through wood. Harris taught Clara to change a stitch without tearing pride, to measure fever with the inside of a wrist, to place steam where lungs would welcome it. The marshal wrote, "Buddy, we look out for one another" on a broad sheet and pinned it beneath the schedule for watches. Days folded into work. Creed healed like timber seasons, slow then all at once. Clara fetched wood, carried water, sorted cartridges, and stirred stew that drew in drifters who left with hats in their hands and new names on the road. She learned which shutter sang when the north wind pressed, which hinge squeaked when a lie tried the door. When Creed could stand without guarding every breath, they went home. Home meant wind combing spruce, hens testing straw with tidy authority, and the cabin squaring its shoulders after violence. Blood shadows had dried to brown scars along the eaves. The creek loosened under the noons. Clara straightened pegs, rewove trip lines, patched chinking, scrubbed powder from the hearth, and moved the bell so it would ring sooner. Creed drew a rectangle on the rear wall and cut a second door through it, framing it in clean pine. She stacked wood in rows that pleased the eye and warmed the idea of evenings. He hung a lantern above the new step, a small sun against early dark. Evenings turned blue, then silver. Mountains stood like guardians and gates, stern and welcoming at once. Freedom stopped being distant and sat beside them like an ordinary chair. They spoke little. He asked whether she meant to stay. She said she would stand wherever her ribs remembered being strong. That might be this bench. That might be a town with a school under cottonwoods. It would never again be a shed with a man counting coins outside the door. He nodded as if that answer fit the shape of his life. Thor arrived in careful step. They rode down to witness Pastor Wren close the ledger with a soft thump. The marshal shook both their hands, as if each palm carried equal maps. Dr. Harris asked about pain, and pretended not to see how Clara steadied Creed with a touch that felt more like partnership than care. Amos stood by the last pew, hat in hand, eyes clearer than before. He did not approach, she did not beckon. Forgiveness might visit someday and call itself something else. Accountability would stay until the lesson was held. Outside, children chalked hopscotch on packed earth, bright lines against brown. A woman with a fading bruise pressed bread into their hands, and insisted it counted as wages for nights. No one wished to remember. Clara thanked her, and meant it. Creed bought nails, flour, and a new file, arguing the price down because accuracy has dignity. People greeted them like neighbors rather than spectators. The square had found a way to hold noise without drowning decency. They returned up the lower road with sacks tied beneath the seat. Snow lingered in hollows like memory, refusing to vanish. The peaks cut clean lines against an honest sky. Clara felt the horse lean, the runners sing, the revolver sit at Creed's hip like a kept promise. She knew a life could hinge on exact choices made at ordinary door. She had stopped performing weakness. Strength asked for no drum, only steady hands and an honest spine. The mountain recognized that version, and let the gates stand open. Work filled the weeks. Spring softened the creek's metal voice. Wild flowers pricked the bank like sparks, choosing to remain. Clara planted onion sets behind the coop, and marked rows with twine. She forged a safer path, down to the water so her boots stopped slipping. He set a low bench by the threshold for mornings when laces need tying without hunching. They argued once over moving a snare mouth 4 inches left. She won because the breeze spoke sideways that day, and he noticed it after. Laundry snapped on the line. A hawk wrote careful circles above the ridge. One afternoon they stood at the new door, and watched shadows climb the slope. "We did not chase a dream," Creed said. "We built a place where decent breath can live. We chose it," she answered. "Choice feels like air." He reached for her hand and did not hurry the touch. She let their fingers rest without disguise. No vows rose, only the quiet that follows true decisions. If you have ever felt a door slam and believed that was the end of your road, keep this account. Strength often waits under panic like a hidden ember. In crisis, cut that ember and breathe until it becomes flame. Tell someone what you chose when fear tried to tighten your world. Pass courage like warm bread. Share Clara's journey so another pair of hands can feel the heat. And if you want more true stories of people who refused the smallness others assigned them, subscribe and stay with us. Your voice may be the light someone else needs. Snow will return. Storms always test houses, yet the cabin stands straighter than any week before. The second door holds fast in its jamb. The bell rings earlier. The mountain has learned their names. When dusk breathes along the ridge, and smoke lifts in a thin blue thread, Clara sits on the step, and does not hide. She looks at the trail and does not shrink from memory. She looks at Creed and does not require rescue to feel safe. She looks inward and finds no costume left to wear. She stands because standing is now her natural height.